Hello everyone, this is Akuchi, and in this video I'm going to talk about Dominion stats, where you can find them, how to interpret them, and why I find them interesting. So the Dominion player Marcus embarked on a project to collect a lot of Dominion stats from top Dominion players. Um, uh, in particular, Dominion played on the Dominion.games website. He used Severi's woodcutter log analysis tool to gather the data, and so the data gathered can tell us information about what cards players gain and what numbers, like in what turns, and that kind of thing. And he's made all this data available. And this Google sheet we're looking at right now is the primary entry point into this data. I'll provide a link in the video description. And so at the top we see some more details about the kinds of games that are recorded in the sample. And so these are games that are collected from the beginning of 2018 up to the present, and games in which only strong players have participated. So this is not a full sample of games, but only those played by strong players. And details are here. And something important to preface right now: the stats are valuable for seeing how good Dominion players right now play with these cards, but they can't tell us like anything about the true. They can't tell us exactly like the true value of any of these cards. It's only how they're used in games with top players. So if we scroll down here, we can see that there are a bunch of links to other Google Sheets, and a lot of them are particular stats for players who have played enough games to have a lot of samples. And so if you're one of these players or interested in how one of these players in particular plays, you can get information about that. But the three most important sub sheets are the top three here. The 5-2 Open I haven't looked at too much, but I believe this is a sample of games in which with which one or more player opens with a 5-2 or a 2-5 in terms of copper. The top one here, the better. So this is a sample of all the games, and the spreadsheet is filtered in a way so that it shows kind of at a glance how often the better player gains, buys, etc. Each card, and how often their opponent does the same. Better here meaning has a higher estimated skill on Dominion.games. And my favorite of the sub spreadsheets is the winner one, which includes all games except ties, I expect. And it shows it from the perspective of how many gains, etc., the winner gets in their opponent, the loser. And winning is something that most of us who play Dominion are interested in to some extent. So I find this the most fascinating. But the better one can also be a useful source of information. Okay, so yeah, you can hover over here and click on the link to look at that subpage. But I have it open so we can look at it here. I just want to point out that there are some other sheets down here which have a variety of information, some of which is quite valuable and can't be found somewhere else. But I'm not going to be talking about that in this video, which I expect will be long enough. So looking at the winner sub spreadsheet, we see this one also has some sub sheets, which I'm not going to talk about. This main sheet, the buys, gains, trashes one, is the one I'm going to talk about and the most important. So what we see here on the left is a list of all the cards that can be gained in Dominion. This includes, most importantly, Kingdom cards, like Acting Troop, and events like Advance, It also contains basic supply cards like copper, silver, province, and also non-supply cards like mercenary and teacher and ghost. So you can get stats about those as well. And so for each of these rows, you see it's going to be counting how many games that there's data about that card appearing. So if I scroll down to silver, which is a card we're going to do a deep dive into pretty soon, we can see it has a whopping 37,000 plus games of data, because silver is always in the kingdom. This is the full data set. So we have a lot of confidence in the data about silver. For a generic kingdom card, like you can see, Shepherd, Silk Road, Shantytown, we have around 1,200, give or take, at the time of this video, and hopefully that number will increase. So we can draw some pretty reasonable conclusions with this amount of data, but when we get a larger sample size, we're going to get even more confident in the data we can provide. Events are going to have actually a little bit less data, and even less than that, we can see the Renaissance cards. Most of the data has been, up to this point, collected before Renaissance came out. So cards like Silk Merchant, we have only about 400 games worth of data. For a card like Sewers, which is a project in Renaissance, we have even less, only 300. So in the immediate future, you should be more less confident about any stats from the Renaissance cards. They may change as we get more data. Okay, so what kind of information can we gather from this spreadsheet? So it has, as promised, data about how often the card on the left is bought, gained, and trashed. And it separates it out by the winner and their opponent, which in this case is the loser. So I find the gains section to be the most valuable. So if we look at, say, Silk Merchant, we can see it's gained a whopping 93% of the time. This is the percent of games in which one or more copy of the card is gained. So in 93% of games, Silk Merchant is gained by the winner, and only 7% of the time is it not gained by the winner. And we can see the loser gains it also a whole lot, 90% of the time. Silk Road, on the other hand, only gained 28% of the time by the winner, whereas the loser gains it 30% of the time. So this is a pretty common trend to see for a good card, a strong card. We tend to see not only is it gained very often, but the winner gains it more often than the loser. And we see the reverse tends to be the case for weaker cards, where not only is it not gained often, but the loser gains it more often than the winner. We don't always see this association. Sometimes a card is both good and seemingly overgained. We can say something is seemingly overgained if the loser gains it more than the winner, and it's seemingly undergained if the winner gains it more than the loser. And we can also get information about the quantity of cards that is gained. So I just want to clarify that these numbers are like pretty similar, so the amount of confidence we should have about that is a little bit low in this case. But there are some cards for which the difference is considerably larger, and we can be more confident in that claim. So quantity gained. So we see here, this is the average number of copies of the card that the winner gains and the loser gains. So we see for Silk Merchant, not only is the winner gaining Silk Merchant in a larger portion of games, but it's also gaining a significantly larger quantity. In Silk Road, we see the interesting case that while the winner gains it in slightly fewer portion of games, it actually gains a little bit more often, Silk Road. And this is averaged over all games in which the card appears. It's not telling us if it is gained, how often, how many copies are gained, of course, for Silk Road. Otherwise, that number could not possibly be less than one. Yeah, and we can get information about how often both players gain the card, either player gains the card, total number stuff. We can get the same sort of information for buys, and we can look at silver here for a pretty dramatic example. Normally, there's going to be like pretty similar. We can see, like Silk Merchant, it's gained in 93% of games, and it's bought in 86% of games. But for silver, we can see while the winner gains silver in 71% of games, they only buy silver in 50% of games. So there's a pretty substantial portion of games where a player will not buy silver, but they will gain it by some other means, like a jack of all trades or delve or something to that effect. We get other information here about trashing. So this one is usually the least useful, but sometimes it can be interesting to see how often a card is trashed. Silk Merchant, since it gives an on-trash benefit, unsurprisingly has a pretty high trash percent. Silver also pretty high at 26%, and I expect that most of these cases are trash for benefit, like counterfeit or remodel. And I think it's like higher than a lot of other cards might be, or are higher than some other cards might be, because there are some dedicated silver gainers like we talked about, like jack of all trades. So if you're getting these silvers at a lower opportunity cost than other cards, then they're better to trash sometimes. Okay, so that's the kind of information you can get from this sheet, but also you can see that there are links to detailed stats for all of these cards on the left. And when we open up this, we get a barrage with a whole bunch of stats and numbers and charts and graphs. And I'm going to do a deep dive into at least how I interpret this data. To do so, I'm going to switch to an image collection, which I've annotated to hopefully make things clearer, because it can be pretty overwhelming to see like all the stats at once if you don't know where to look. So I kind of divide up into 9 different quadrants. Well, I guess they're not quadrants. They'd be something else. Noctants? I don't know. 9 different regions to talk about the stats in more detail. So first I want to draw your attention to the top right. I cover these areas kind of in what I think is the most important. So if you're only gonna you want to like start looking in the upper right, that tells me at least the first kinds of things I want to know about the card, and then I gravitate towards other sections in order to get more information about the card. So we're gonna like zoom in here, so don't be alarmed. Okay, so still looking at the upper right, I'm highlighting this section up here, which has gained, opened, both, won, neither, and some percents. And the way I like to think about, or like to talk about these stats, is what question are these stats answering? And it's important that you don't like misunderstand what question a stat is answering. So it's like they're all answering very particular questions, and they might not be exactly the question you're interested in. And it might be the case that either it's not possible to have a stat about that, or that information is answered somewhere else. So this top information, the question it's answering is, how often is this card, in this case silver, gained, and how often is it opened? So in all the games in which silver appears, it's gained by both players in 61% of the time. It's gained by just one player 24% of the time, and neither player 15% of the time. And then opened, that means how often is it gained before turn 3, in turns 1 or 2. And we see these numbers are quite a bit smaller. It's gained less than 50% of the time in the opening. Okay, and so we don't get to see the like this is a repeat of some of the information we saw on that spreadsheet before, but it's actually missing a little bit of summary that I find valuable. Like one of the most valuable numbers is like how often the winner gains the card, and how often the loser gains the card. We don't get that quite here, but we do get information about the stats. So the next most important section here, I think, is this raw value. So we see some percents, and the question this is answering is, when only one player gains or opens with the card, how often do they win? And I want to focus, these stats do not tell any information about the games in which both players gain the card, and it doesn't provide any information about the games in which neither player gains the card. It's focusing just on the cases where only one player gains one or more copies of the card. So in the silver's case, that's just 24% of games value. So in those games, how often does that one player who gains silver perform? And in this case, they only win 42% of the games. So that's less than 50%. So this is an indication that silver might be overgained. It's gained in these marginal games where only one player gains it, they underperform, and they win less than 50% of the time. We see similar information for opened. The number is not nearly as drastic here. So opening, being the only person to open silver, is closer to 50%, but still below 50%. So we might also say with just a little bit less confidence or certainty that silver is opened too often, if your goal is to win. Next, I want to draw attention to the expected stat. Now this one is a little bit complicated or confusing. So in Dominion.games, whenever people are playing ranked games, which are where all these stats are gathered from, Dominion.games has a representation of their expected skill, and this is represented by the Greek character mu in the Glyco system, which it uses. I'm not going to go into detail here, but there's like a mathematical relationship between any two players' mu value. Like if a player with a 2 mu value plays against somebody with a 1 mu value, then they'll be expected to win a certain percent of the time. I don't know exactly what it is, like 78%, 76%, something like that. But they're expected to win that many games. So we have information in these logs about how often a player is expected to win against the other. And why is this important? Because we have a biased sample right now. We're looking at only the games in which one player gains silver, this 24% of games. But maybe the player who's gaining silver is a lower or higher skilled player on average. So that's what this question, or this stat, is answering. The question of, when only one player gains or opens with this card, how often are they expected to win? And the answer in the case of silver is they're expected to win 47% of the time, which means that on average, a lower skilled players will gain silver and also open silver more often than higher skilled players. So independent of like how the game played out, like we expect them to win 47% of the time just based on their skill differential. However, they actually win the game less often than that, 42% over all this data. So even if even accounting for the fact that lower skilled players gain silver more often than higher skilled players, they still underperform, is what this is showing. And this corrected for skill value is some attempt to consolidate these two pieces of information, the raw and the expected. I won't pretend to know exactly how it's doing so, and I don't give a whole lot of significance to this particular value, but this one is important only insofar as if it's dramatically different from the raw value, that's a good indication that there's a large bias in like the sample of players who are gaining only one player gaining that card. Sorry if that was a little confusing, but basically we want to understand in this sample with only one player gaining the card how often they are expected to win, and that way we can better understand how often they actually win when they gain the card. Okay, something else I want to note is the plus or minus percent. So you're going to see this in a lot of stats, and this represents the a degree of uncertainty that we have in the stats. I believe that all of the stats are portraying a 95% confidence interval, and I'm not a statistician, but so hopefully I don't mangle this. But I believe what that means is, assuming we had infinite data, we had the absolute truth of the matter in terms of how people play with silver, we would be 95% confident that the true value is within the plus or minus range here. So the raw value might not be exactly 42%. It could be 41.5% or 42.5%, but it's pretty likely to be in that range. So we can see that the error, or whatever you want to call it, is pretty low in the case of silver because we have a whole lot of data. This number is quite a bit higher for other cards, and so whenever this number is pretty large, that should be your cue to be less confident with any conclusions you draw from the data. In particular, if say in the case of opening silver, if we saw the uncertainty was close to 4%, then we might be really reluctant to draw a conclusion that opening silver is it happens too often. Just something else I want to touch on. So these stats are indicating that gaining silver, silver's gained too often. But obviously the stats can't tell us anything about the specifics of a game. In which of these 24% of games was it incorrect for the one player to gain the silver? We don't have that information. And we also don't know anything about, well, what about in the 61% of the games when both players gained it? Was it correct for them to gain silver? Maybe one of them would have done better if they didn't gain silver. Likewise, in the 15% where neither gained silver, maybe if one player gained silver, they would have done better. We don't have data about that, so it's something to point out about the limitation of the data we do have. Okay, moving on. So let's look at the top center section here, get some more data, zooming in on it. So up at the top here, it's answering the question about quantity. How many copies of the card are gained on average? So this is all games in which the card appears in the kingdom is what the average gains is showing. And then average when gained is showing, well, in those games where the player gains one or more copies, what quantity do they gain on average? And it's split up by player 1, player 2. Usually you don't get much different values here, but sometimes they're different, and maybe you can draw some conclusions from that. So we see for silver that it's 2.4. It's the average number of copies of silver gained. When silver is gained, 3.3 is the average number. Moving on, so this lower section, this is a really cool kind of recent addition to the stats, and it shows which cards and which types of cards, when they're present in the kingdom, result in more or fewer copies of the card being gained. That's a lot to unpack, but the summary is it's showing synergies and anti-synergies. So there's a lot of, if you're familiar with Dominion, hopefully a lot of this should make sense, that silver is gained more often with these cards, which are all silver gainers. And the types of cards are actually a little more confusing, and they're a little bit fuzzy. Sometimes they'll make a lot of intuitive sense. Other times It'll be a bit of a head scratcher, but this is what the data shows. And then the anti-synergies will hopefully also make a good bit of sense, but they're quite a bit more varied in terms of silver. So it's a pretty fun thought exercise to see if any of these, like, you can come up with an explanation for these. Sometimes with cards that have a lot less data, you can't. There's just some error. Like the sample is too small, and there just happen to be, like, there aren't that many games with any two combinations of kingdom cards. So the synergies and anti-synergies will get more valuable as there's more data. Like for silver, these are quite valuable. I guess just one caveat here. What is exactly answering is when these cards are present in the kingdom, does that result in more or fewer copies of silver, in this case, being gained? So it is not answering a question about, when you gain market squares, do you gain less silvers? No, it's saying when market square is in the kingdom, whether or not it's gained, which sometimes makes a difference. So that's that section. Now drawing your attention to the upper left, a lot of cool information here. So I guess I don't have a section for this, but at the top it's showing the sample again, how many games we have that we're pulling the data from. This is actually a slightly different number than we saw on the other page, the winner-loser page. I don't actually have an explanation for why that's different, but maybe Marcus does. Okay, so this is answering a bunch of different questions, and they're all about when this card is present in the kingdom. They're not about this card being gained or bought or anything like that. So for silver, this is in a sense useless because it's just showing all games of Dominion ever. But it's actually pretty useful because we get to see a nice little average of all the games of Dominion. What are these values? Okay, so the first player stat is answering the question of when this card is in the kingdom, how often does player 1 win? And here we see the kind of overall first player advantage is 59% for the sample of games that we have. This can be higher or lower for cards. It's a pretty, what's the word I'm looking for? High error, I guess, value. High in, like, confounders. I wouldn't put usually too much stock in this. Also, it doesn't vary a whole lot, like 54% to like 63% or something. It's all in that range, which if it was higher confidence, would be pretty significant. Okay, so the next question being answered with the skill multiplier section is when this card is in the kingdom, how often does the better player win? Now, it's not answering that question in a percent because it is also accounting for how much better the player is. And I don't have an exact answer for what, like, this particular stat is, but I do know that if it is greater than 1, then that means that the better player wins more than expected. And if it is less than 1, that means that the better player wins less than expected. So theoretically, this value ought to be 1 for the full sample of games, and would be in a world in which Dominion.games had a perfect representation of each player's skill. But in fact, we see that it's lower than 1, which means that the player that Dominion.games think is better underperforms on net, and the player Dominion.games think is worse overperforms on net. And so what this 0.97 is actually capturing is regression to the mean, I think, in terms of people will oscillate in their skill, and people who are particularly high rated are more likely to actually lose rating, and people who are lower rated are more likely to gain rating on net. But it's pretty small. It's close to 1. And you'll see this number vary quite a bit. Once again, has quite a bit of uncertainty, but normally you'll see some pretty expected values here. High skill cards being higher than 1, and kind of swingy cards being lower than 1. This one is really cool, and a pretty recent addition. So these stats that I've highlighted are answering the question of, when this card is in the kingdom, how does the game end? And it's answering this question in a few different ways, or 2 different ways. First, by what is the endgame condition? So in Dominion, there are 2 recognized endgame conditions, ending on province pile or colony pile, and ending on 3 other piles. And then you can resign at any time in Dominion.games, so that's a third way in which the game can end. Those of you who are good at fast math will recognize that this does not add up to 100%. It actually adds up to 104%. What's going on there is that we don't, the stats, so by analyzing the log, we get a lot of information, but we don't have a full picture of how the game ends, because the last decision of the game, I think, doesn't get reported, and sometimes that's relevant. So the way that Marcus is counting province endings is if the game ends and there's 1 or fewer provinces left in the pile, because otherwise that wouldn't capture some games where buying province is the last decision. And 3 pile is similar. It's looking for if it's 1 or more gain away from a 3 pile ending. But there are some games for which both of those conditions are true. And so that's why it adds up to slightly more than 100%. But these are really interesting. You can see some wild variations in how often, when a card is in the kingdom, the game ends on resignation, or on province ending, or on 3 pile ending. And so these are really cool. The second section is also really cool, showing the average number of turns that a game will last when this card is in the kingdom. And so here we get the baseline, because again, silver is showing all the games. Silver is always in the kingdom, and it's showing that the average game will last 15.4 turns in this sample of data, and if we discard the games in which a resignation occurs, then it's a little higher, 16.7 turns on average. And the final stat is showing how often, when this card is in the kingdom, the pile empties. So the complete silver pile emptying is a rare occurrence. It is not a 0% occurrence, so I think there probably ought to be some extra precision here. But all we know here is that the silver pile empties in fewer than 0.5% of games. But I know from firsthand experience that it empties a non-0% of the time. Okay, so that's the top left section. Really cool set of data, kind of recently added. Moving on to some of these charts and graphs, I find these less useful on the whole than the information we've already covered, but there is some valuable information to be gained, especially from this first chart. So looking at this chart, I guess the question it's answering, this chart, is when gaining n copies of the card, how often does a player win? And this is showing that, like, a player can gain 0 copies of silver. How often do they win? A player can gain 1 copy of silver. How often do they win? Etc., etc. There are multiple dots, usually 2, sometimes 3. The blue dot means just the raw win percent. Just how often. A player gains 0 silvers, how often do they win? And we can eyeball this. The answer is like 54%. The green dot is corrected for skill. So this is trying to correct for people gaining 0 silvers win 54% of the time, but they were actually expected to win more than 50% of the time, as it is in this case. Because there's a bias in the sample. Of the times in which a player gains 0 silvers, they are more likely to be a higher skilled player. Therefore, trying to correct for that is where we get the green dot. And again, like, I wouldn't put too much importance in this unless it's very different from the blue dot. And then when the sample size is low, sometimes you get some pretty weird artifacts here. But for silver, it's just kind of the expected thing that gaining 0 silvers is a more common play by a higher skilled player. So we see that correct a little bit downwards. But even correcting for skill, gaining 0 silvers has a above 50% association with winning. Gaining 1 silver, also a slightly above average play. And then we see this number drop for gaining more. So does this mean that gaining more than 1 silver is always like a bad idea? Of course not. Like, this is showing all the games ever. There are plenty of games where gaining 2, 3, or even more silvers is a winning play. But it's just showing, on the whole, like, when a player gains exactly this many copies of the card, how often do they win? These numbers are all within a range. Like, none of these numbers dip below 45%. So it's not like gaining a certain number of copies of silver is a catastrophically bad idea. We can draw that conclusion for some cards. We cannot draw that conclusion like for silver in this data. It's just kind of a general trend. This chart can be quite interesting. So in terms of this chart telling us information we didn't know before, I think it's particularly interesting in cards where you know that gaining like maybe 2 or 3 is good, or 1 or 2 is good, but how often is 1 better than 2, or like how often is 2 better than 3? You can get a little more data in this case. So you might want to know, like, Mercenary, a non-supply card. Is 1 Mercenary better than 2 Mercenaries? Now, you don't like exactly get an answer to that question, but the question you do have answered is, when a player gains 1 Mercenary, how often do they win? And when a player gains 2 Mercenaries, how often do they win? And that's still a pretty valuable question to get an answer to. Okay, so there's this black bar over here. What's this all about? So there is also sometimes, for when there's enough data about, well, how often does a player win when they not only gain 7+ copies of silver in this case, but also the silver's empty. So it's a subset of that data set. And in this case, we can see gaining 7+ silvers is not necessarily a winning play, but if the silver pile empties, it's more likely than not a winning play. Because you can imagine that subset of games is selected for games where silver is really important, maybe Tower, maybe Feudum, something of that nature. So another question you may have already had, but it becomes super obvious when you look at this black bar. What is this vertical line all about? And these others have different length vertical lines. What are those? And the vertical size of the vertical lines are representing, once again, the 95% confidence interval. So there's a different subset of games for each of these data points. We can see that the line, like the vertical bars, are very small for 0, 1, and 2, and they get larger for more, because we have more games in which a player gains exactly 1 silver than we do games in which a player gains exactly 6 silvers. So we have more uncertainty about the win rate of a player gaining 6 silvers than we do gaining 1 silver. And this is silver. Like, these bars are quite a bit larger for the cards that we have less data about. So to take all this with a pretty big grain of salt, because we're like subdividing the data even further. When we're looking at, well, that 24% of case when only 1 player gains it, we had a lot more data than we were looking at, well, when a player gains exactly 6 copies of silver. That's a smaller sample. And this black bar is very large because it's a very small sample of games in which a player gains 7+ silvers and the silver pile empties. We saw from the previous slide that the silver pile empties less than 1 out of 200 games, so very unlikely occurrence indeed. All right, moving on. So this graph underneath the other one is related. it's kind of reversing the question. So if you remember, the question that this chart was answering is, when gaining n copies of the card, how often does a player win? And this one reverses the question and asks, how often does the winner or the loser gain n copies of the card? See the slightly reversed directionality of the question. You can see it all adds up to 1, which means 100% of games. We're capturing 100% of games in which silver is in the kingdom, and we can see that eyeballing it, in like 29% of games, the winner gains 0 copies of silver. And then, this amount of the time they gain 1. So the winner gains 0 or 1 silvers more often than the loser. This makes sense given the chart we saw earlier, where we saw that gaining 0 or 1 silvers is associated with winning. And then the bars kind of reverse in that the loser is more likely to gain 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. Copies of silver. This is a pretty cool chart. Moving on to the next set of charts. So the last chart was showing the absolute number of silvers gained. This chart is answering the question of, when gaining n or more copies of the card than the opponent, how often does a player win? So we look at a player. If they gain 1 more silver than the opponent, how often do they win? And it looks like about 45% of the time. How about 2, 3, 4 more copies than the opponent? Well, that's even worse, 42% or something on average. And then we look at 7 plus and we say, well, if you're gaining that many more silvers than the opponent, maybe silvers are pretty good. And that's actually maybe a winning play. So we see both the blue dot and the green dot. Same deal here, raw and corrected for skill. And also we see the black dot make an appearance. Here, very positive. In the event that the silver pile empties, gaining more silvers than your opponent is a good thing to do. Gaining vastly more silvers than your opponent. So this one usually tells a story you can get from the other stats we've looked at so far. It shouldn't be a surprise to us at this point that gaining more silvers is associated with performing less well. And again, like reversing the question, the graph below it answers how often does the winner or the loser gain n more copies of the card than the opponent. And this number does not add up, or like the graph at the bottom doesn't add up to 1. However, if you add up like the number that we see for the loser and the number for the winner, and the combination of those two, and then you take 1 and subtract from that sum, you'll actually get the percentage of games in which the winner and the loser gain the same number of silvers. So that's what that number is showing. So that's probably a more complicated way of putting it. So a simpler way of putting it is, in eyeballing it, 39% of games, the loser gains more silvers than the winner. In 30% of games, the winner gains more silver than the loser. And then I was mentioning that difference between the two, which is, I guess, like 31%, 21%. 31% is when the winner and the loser gain the exact same number of silvers. So here's presenting the data in the same way. And so while it looked like a blowout in the chart before, like, oh my gosh, gaining more silver is it's just always associated with losing. The graph here makes it more apparent that the scale of this is the chart maybe overstates that, because there are still tons of games, 30 plus % of games, where the winner gains more silver than the loser. While yes, like seemingly the stats indicate that silver is overgained, it's not by like a crazy margin. It's not. That's what I take away from this. All right, looking at these vertical graphs in the right-hand side, showing more gain data in a different way. So this guy is answering the question, on what turn does the winner or loser gain n copies of the card? Okay, and so what is this number like? What is the height of this graph showing? It's showing the average number of silver gained by the loser, the L, and the winner, the W. And if we back up, we can see that this number actually correlates, backing way up to the section here. Okay, it doesn't show winner or loser here, but it's actually correlating with average gains. We can see it on the spreadsheet. But you see like 2.4 is the average gains for silver on the whole, and we can see, like eyeballing this, it's like it looks like 2.5, the loser gains 2.5 silvers and the winner gains 2.3 silvers, something around there. And I think we can confirm that on the spreadsheet. So that's what the height of the graph is showing. And then the data in here is showing on what turn, on average, a player has that many silvers. So if we look at 1, we can see that on average, across all the games, the loser has 1 silver on turn 6, or by turn 6, I think. And the winner has 1 silver on average by turn 6 or 7. And we can get more information here. I don't find this graph particularly useful, I want to say, because it's averaging all games, even games where silver isn't gained, so it's like it's a little bit misleading. This graph, I think, is actually a little cooler. So it's answering the question of, on what turn does the winner or loser gain the first copy of the card? So this is interesting, and the height of this graph is actually showing how often the loser and the winner gain 1 or more copies of the card, silver in this case. So I mentioned how the stats in the upper right don't show like the exact value I really like from the spreadsheet. Well, this graph actually does. It shows that 70, I think 5% or 74 or 75, and the 71% value that we saw in the spreadsheet. The winner gains silver in 1 or more silver in 71% of games. The loser in, I want to say 75% of games. Maybe it's 74. I don't know. No, I think it's 75. Anyways, but here we can see that. So that's pretty useful. And so you can just glance at this chart. This is like an exception to the order rule. You might want to glance at this chart briefly to see, does the winner gain the card more than the loser, or vice versa? The height of this bar will tell you that data. And it will also tell you on what turn, on average, you can say in what percent of games does, you can get additional data here, like on what percent of games does the winner gain a silver before turn 3, and that stat should also correspond to the opening data that we have up there. So it looks like in 30% of games the winner gains a silver before turn 3, and in 32% of games or so the loser does. So this can be a really useful graph. This is one of my favorite of the graphs. Lets you show how early a card ends up being gained. All right, moving on to the bottom section, and we'll try to get through this quick. So this is showing information about how many times the card is played. So almost all this other information is about gaining, sometimes about when the card is in the kingdom. This bottom section is about plays of the card. And I tend to find it less useful than some of the other stuff, but it can be valuable. Okay, so this chart, what is it answering? When playing the card T times, how often does a player win? So very similar to the gain chart, but this is the number of times that silver is played. So as you can imagine, playing silver 0 times is like the stat is almost identical to gaining silver 0 times, because hopefully you play silver if you gain it. But then here we see, well, if you do end up gaining silver, playing it more is better than playing it less. And this is a common trend you see for almost all the data, because no matter how like good or bad the card is, if you do have the card, playing it more is associated with winning, because that means your deck, like you're seeing cards in your deck more often. You just like have a better deck. You're playing better. So almost all cards like show this trend of playing it more is associated with winning. So the graph below, once again, it flips the question around. How often does the winner or loser play the card T times? And so, yeah, we just get the data presented in the opposite way. And so here we can see that because the winner gains 0 silvers more often than the loser, they play it more often, 0 more often than the loser. But then it quickly, like the lower values of playing silver are underrepresented for the winner and overrepresented for the loser. Moving on. Similar trend. Here we're seeing, on the graph, the charts above we saw, gain related stuff, and the second set of like chart and graph were related to relative gains. And this chart is related to relative plays. So its question it's answering is, when playing a card T times more than the opponent, how often does a player win? And this is an especially boring chart because it's almost always increasing in some way. Playing a card more than the opponent is almost always associated with winning. The graph flips around the question, same kind of thing. How often does the winner or loser play the card T times more than the opponent? And I wonder what the length of this chart is showing. Oh, yeah, okay. Yeah, it's showing that in 41% of games, the winner plays silver more often than the loser. I should clarify. In all these plays, charts and graphs, it's not talking about a single copy of silver. It's talking about how many times is any copy of silver played by that player. Just in case that wasn't clear. But yeah, so this is showing that even though the winner gains silver less often than the loser, they play the silver more often than the loser when they do gain it. Enough to overcome that difference. And this is very common for almost all cards. It takes like a really bad card for that to be not the case. Okay, so now we've got a couple more vertical graphs. This one answering the question of, on what turn does the winner or loser play the card T times? So, I don't know. This could be valuable. The height of the graph is the average number of times the card is played, which can be pretty useful. So you see here that the winner, on average, will play across all games in which silver is in the kingdom, will play silver more than 7 times, and the loser will play it fewer than 7 times through the course of the game, which seems pretty low, but remember it does include those games in which silver is not gained. The more interesting graph, once again, is the first play one. So this one answering the question, on what turn does the winner or loser first play the card? And so here you can see like what portion of games has silver played before turn 5. So yeah, interesting like thing here. We can see it's like pretty close, this like 4 threshold. Like, is a silver played on turn 3 or 4? It can be like a pretty important thing. And so we can see some like, there can be confounders here, right? Like this gap is a lot smaller than the like silver opened gap, And the reason for that is just like if you do both like get a silver, or if one person gets a silver the other doesn't, but the person who gets a silver actually sees it on turn 3 or 4, they're just going to be winning more often, just because having one of your openings miss your shuffle is bad. Just something to note there. The height of here should be like the same as the gain one, and for silver like probably is, but for other cards there could be a difference if you gain the card but don't actually play it. Okay, so that's it for the deep dive. We have now at this point covered all the stats we see here. So hopefully now you have an understanding of what these stats do, and kind of at least you know my preference for what order to look at the stats, and what kind of conclusions I can draw from them. Okay, so returning back to our internet. So I want to briefly look at some other cards just to show. We've been focusing on silver for this deep dive. Some other cards showcase some different trends, and so I just want to give an example of like an analysis of those cards. So first we're going to look at Groundskeeper. So Groundskeeper, cantrip, strong card, and so if we look in the top right, we're going in like kind of the same order. We can see it's gained very often, although not actually quite as often as silver. However, when only one player gains it, they have a above 50% win rate. They are expected to win more than 50%. So this is telling us that better players are more likely to gain Groundskeeper than weaker players. However, our raw value is even higher than that, so it's actually, we can be pretty confident that gaining Groundskeepers on the margin is a winning play. Another way to phrase it is Groundskeeper is seemingly undergained right now in the data we have. Nobody has opened Groundskeeper, or it's low enough to be a rounding error, so good job everybody. Groundskeeper is indeed a terrible opening. Over here we can see some cool synergies and anti-synergies, which hopefully make some sense, but it wouldn't surprise me if some of them don't. And then we see like how many are gained, so it's not the case that Groundskeeper is a card you just want a couple of. No, you want a lot of them when you want them. Looking over on the left-hand side, we can see, like looking at the bottom, Groundskeeper, in fact, the pile empties in a third of the games in which it appears. So often a contested pile. Going up to the top, first player advantage, nothing significant. Skill multiplier above 1, but the uncertainty is like pretty high, so we can't be like really confident. Like we can be like this makes it more likely than not that it's like a high skilled card, a card that when it's in the kingdom it favors the higher skilled player, but we can't be super confident with the data sample we have. Look at this is really powerful difference. So there's color coding here, which is really cool, and that shows the difference from the total sample of games. And we can always look at one of these base supply cards if we wanted to see like what the total sample was. So if you remember here, province ending 38% in all the sample, only 20% with Groundskeeper. So we see a lot more 3-pile endings with Groundskeeper and more resignations than we do province endings, which makes sense because Groundskeeper encourages players to maybe pick up estates or maybe duchies, and Groundskeeper itself might pile, so that's going to push to 3-pile ending. And then we can also see the average turns is larger than it is in the overall game sample, and this is also to be expected for alternative VP. We would expect the game to last longer. Attacks, we would also expect the game to last longer. Otherwise, strong cards, we would expect the game to take less time. So kind of just looking at the charts briefly. So how many groundskeepers is the right number to gain? The more the merrier is what the chart seems to indicate, and that's true enough. It's something to point out is how an empty pile affects the stats. So we can see that like gaining 3 groundskeepers is like it can be a fine play, like you win 45% of the time if you gain 3 groundskeepers. But in the subset of games in which the groundskeeper pile empties, your win rate would plummet in that case, having just 3, down to like 24 or 23%. So we can actually, like, we don't have the exact bars to show this, but it's clear to see that if we actually discounted this case, gaining 3 would be like a positive value in the cases when the groundskeeper pile doesn't empty. But yeah, usually for piles that empty, we see a pretty consistent increase here. Like gaining 3 is bad, gaining 7 plus is good. Like in the normal distribution you expect. If the card is good and it piles, then being on the winning side of that split is the place you want to be. Yeah, and we can see like gaining 0 groundskeepers is slightly below 50%, but only slightly. Like that's showing that very clearly there are games in which it's correct to gain 0 groundskeepers, as we all know. It's just like a sanity check or whatever. Gains relative to opponent. So this is all positive, suggesting that gaining more groundskeepers is on net good. Just notice how large these bars are, the uncertainty. So, like, while we can be pretty confident of this, like the exact amount it's better is wildly uncertain. This is like pretty shocking, right? So we remember silver. If we look at this graph down here, it's not that much different. There are plenty of games where the winner gains more silver than the loser, even though it happens more often by the loser. Groundskeeper, not so much. There are fewer than there's only fewer than 21% of games where the loser gains more groundskeeper than the winner, whereas there's 45% of games where the winner gains more groundskeepers than the loser. So this is like a pretty big difference, suggesting that groundskeeper is pretty significantly undergained in the data set we have. I don't think anything else is particularly worth pointing out here. Just another example that playing the card more, like this graph is almost always positive, and like really crazy positive, because it's just confounding a lot of factors together, I think. Okay, that's Groundskeeper, kind of like a good Kingdom card. I want to point out that the view for events is a bit different, because you don't play events, so all those stats disappear, and all the gain stats are replaced by buys, like very smoothly. So we can get the same kind of information. Here we're looking at Traveling Fair, a adventures event, and it's gained very often, but it's actually a pretty sizable chunk of data for only one player. Excuse me, I said gained, bought. A sizable chunk of data for only one person buying Traveling Fair, and we can actually see some really radical values here, even larger than the groundskeeper numbers. So, like, being in the sample where only one person buys Traveling Fair, they win a lot. And okay, yes, the better player buys Traveling Fair more, but even taking that into account, it's really significant how buying Traveling Fair is associated with winning. So this is a pretty eye-opening thing. Wow, maybe Traveling Fair is really underbought, and Traveling Fair in the opening even is maybe that's a good idea. It seems like this is something that better players have picked up on, because we can see this corrected for skill value is a lot closer to 50. So this is something that like better players probably have picked up on, but here it's showing that even better players might not be buying traveling fare when they ought to. Now, I guess something that should be mentioned that there could be some confounding here because traveling fare might be the kind of thing that you buy on the last turn of the game, like when you're about to win, and in that case, it shouldn't like it's not. It's kind of like a symptom of winning rather than the cause of winning. So that's just something to take note of that could be confounding some of these stats. Go all the way to the left-hand side just to see traveling fare, 3 pile more than province, but not like not as a substantial difference as groundskeeper. The average turns, however, we can see are lower than the overall sample, with like the silver data shows us 15.4 and here 14.8. So pretty significant. Traveling fare makes games faster, which is again what we expect to see for a card that is strong and is not alternative VP and is not an attack. Okay, buys per player is just like the buys relative to opponent chart here is just showing, yeah, buying more traveling fares is really strongly associated with winning. So it's unfortunate we can't entirely rule out cause and effect here, but I think we can be pretty confident that there's some cause going on here that buying traveling fare is going to help your case for winning. Okay, moving on next. Raise showcases something pretty interesting with this corrected for skill value. So I've seen quite a few people get confused by this on Raise. They see this like 37% corrected for skill value. Like, whoa, does this mean Raise is a bad card? Okay, the first thing we're looking at is gains. Like I said, Raise has gained a lot. A way lot. More than any other card we've seen. Raise has gained a ton. And we look at the raw value next and we see, okay, in these 18% of games where only one player gains Raise, they win 50% of the time. Okay. So Raise maybe is not overgained or undergained. I don't know. It's in the middle maybe. But then we see the expected value is above 50%. So this is telling us that when in these 18% of games, when only one player gains it, they are more often the higher ranked player. So they're actually expected to win more than 56% or more than 50% of the time. They only win 50% of the time. Therefore, this corrected for skill value is less than 50%. Now, I couldn't tell you why it's 13 points less, whereas this one is 6 points more. Like, I don't know the answer to that. But the important thing is the directionality here is showing that we can the inference I draw from this data is Raise is great because it's gained a ton. However, it in particular might be overgained by very skilled players. And this is actually a trend we see for quite a lot of trashing cards. I think the better players, okay, just a reminder, this data is from all good Dominion players. Like, there aren't hardly any bad Dominion players included in this data set. But the better end of those good Dominion players might be slightly overvaluing trashing at this point. Trashing is very good in Dominion. Almost everybody in this data set recognizes that. I think the better players are more likely to overinvest in trashing because they want that consistency, especially if they are playing against a lower ranked player. But that might actually be costing them sometimes in tempo or whatnot. That's a speculative reading interpretation of what this means. But that's how I interpret this kind of crazy stat. Nothing else about this data is like stands out a bunch. There's like a lot of uncertainty. Like looking at this chart, it's just like, is gaining more raises good or bad? Nah, I can't draw a strong conclusion. I guess one more other thing worth pointing out is the average turns count. So again, this is lower than the like full data set, which is another indication that Raise is a strong card. Compared to Traveling Fair, it's like pretty close, probably within the margin of error, but the error isn't actually reported here. I don't know how it would be calculated, which is probably why it isn't reported. But yeah, so no, this doesn't mean Raise is a bad card. In particular, like it means that it's overgained by better players, seemingly. And finally, looking at something that's a bit of a reverse of that phenomenon is Rebuild. First, we look up here, and this kind of already diffuses the like 2015 and 16 era myth of Rebuild being this very unbeatable strategy, because we can see Rebuild is actually gained in by the winner, or like by the average player, in fewer than 50% of games. And there's a whopping 37% of games where neither player gains a Rebuild. So Rebuild, hardly like a niche card, but also not this must-buy like dominant card from this stats. And then we look down here and say, in those 33% of games where only one player gains Rebuild, they actually are losing more often than they're winning. However, then we go ahead and look at the expected number, and we see, oh, well, it looks like the higher skilled player is gaining Rebuild less often than the lower skilled player. So in this sample of 33% where only one player gains Rebuild, the player gaining Rebuild is expected to win 41% of the time. So then when we get to the corrected for skill, it's about 50%. So we can't actually say with any confidence whether Rebuild is overgained or undergained. This like kind of story here is maybe it is like people are gaining Rebuild at around the right amount. Like maybe better players are better playing against Rebuild than like the weaker players, and the weaker players are correct to be getting Rebuild at the rate they are. We don't really have enough data to say like people are playing incorrectly in any like with any high degree of confidence, I'd say, with this data. Here I just want to highlight this chart always showing that playing more than the opponent is good. I guess like another, this chart is pretty interesting, the gains per player chart. We can see gaining 0 Rebuilds is associated with neutrality or ever so slightly winning. Gaining 1 Rebuild, really bad idea. This is like pretty intuitive. If you're going to get Rebuild, getting 1 is pretty weird. It's not like you always lose when you get 1, but it's definitely a dubious thing to do. And the stats just confirm it. And then here is one of those cases that I alluded to earlier, where this chart is actually pretty cool because it can show you, is 2 Rebuilds enough? Or is 3 or more better? And the chart makes a pretty strong case that 2 Rebuilds is a lot worse than getting 3. And again, some of this can be like maybe it's confusing the symptom with the cause, that if you get lucky with getting 5s, you'll end up with 3 before you have to switch to buying duchies or whatever. So that could be an element there, but I think there's just a little more data point in favor of get 3 or more Rebuilds most of the time is more winning than getting 2 if you're doing the rebuild thing. I guess the only other interesting thing here is take a look at like first player advantage is significantly above the mean. Skill multiplier is a little lower, but still kind of in the margin of error. Province ending is like huge over average, or pretty large, and then like these other two are below average, and this matches our expectations, our understandings, and then you can get an estimate of how fast games are with rebuild. Yep, sure enough, they're faster, but not like super duper fast. Like Traveling Fair and Raise had some similar values for the speed of the game. And yeah, so that's just looking at a few stats and or a few cards and interpreting what the stats mean. Um, and yeah, I find this really fascinating. We have a whole bunch of data. I'm really thankful for Marcus for collecting this and presenting it. And it's just, I think, a one more tool to help us understand the game of Dominion, how it's, in particular, how it's currently being played, but also giving us some hints as to what we might be able to do to play the game better. And so that's what I really appreciate about these stats. So summary, this is the entry point spreadsheet. Link in below in the description. The winner subpage is my favorite of the subpages. It gives good at-a-glance information for how often the winner gains that card and comparing it to like how often the loser gains it. Really simple stuff to do, and you get more information from this data too, and it also has links to the detailed stats that we looked at here that has a whole wealth of information, and you can get a lot of cool data from that. Focus in on, okay, well, what question are these stats? Is this particular stat answering? Try not to make a mistake of thinking that the stat is answering a different kind of question. And that's it. Hopefully you enjoyed this video, and hopefully you find some value in looking at Dominion stats. Until next time.